Welcome back. Tonight, we're heading somewhere cold, remote, and very quiet. Antarctica. There's a monitoring station out there that was left running on its own for years. No staff, no contact, just systems doing what they were designed to do. At least, that's what everyone thought. Let's begin. The helicopter banked away before I'd even cleared the rotor wash. One moment, the crew chief was handing down a hard case of supplies. The next, he was pulling the door shut and they were gone. The sound dropped fast out there. A few seconds and the rotors were just a vibration in the ice, and then nothing. I stood there with a dry bag over one shoulder and a hard case in each hand and looked at the bunker. It's not much to look at. Prefab modular shell, matte gray with the NIPR designation stenciled on the south-facing panel, faded enough that you had to already know what it said to read it. The entire vestibule had a thermal lock with a 9-digit code, and the code was printed on a card in my breast pocket because whoever designed the intake procedure understood that nobody memorizes 9-digit codes when they're cold. The whole structure sat low against the ridge, bolted down with frost anchors. It was surrounded by about 40 meters of wind-scoured rock before the ground dropped off toward the glacier below. On a clear day, I was told you could see the tongue extending out into the bay. It was not a clear day. Visibility maybe 400 meters. The glacier somewhere in the gray below. Invisible and enormous. I punched in the code, cycled the vestibule, and went inside. The smell hit first. 3 years unmanned, and the air recycler had been running on minimal cycles. Technically functional and compliant, but not what you'd call fresh. The lights came up on motion trigger, fluorescent strips across the ceiling doing that half-second flicker before they committed. I set the cases down, unzipped my outer shell, and pulled out the laminated checklist off the wall mount where someone had bolted it, presumably for someone like me. 16 pages, spiral bound under the laminate, double-sided, the kind of document that takes 3 committees and 18 months to produce and conveys about 4 hours of actual work if you read it straight. I'd read it on the flight down. I'd read it twice. The bunker's function is atmospheric and glaciological monitoring, sensor arrays for temperature gradient, barometric pressure, ice mass telemetry, and a secondary suite for particulate and wind shear data that feeds into a broader Antarctic network. The kind of data that matters enormously to people running climate models and means nothing to anyone else. I've been maintaining NIPR installations for 11 years. Before this posting, I spent 9 days in a near-identical unit on the Ross Ice Shelf, and before that, a winter rotation at a relay station near Dumont d'Urville. The work is pretty simple. It rewards patience and punishes impatience, and it very rarely surprises you. That's the appeal, honestly. Or it was. Day 1 was clean. I worked through the interior systems first. Firmware versions, calibration status, battery backup levels, sensor array outputs. The temperature gradient stack was running about 6 weeks behind on calibration drift, which was expected for a 3-year unmanned stretch and well within correctable range. The barometric suite was actually in decent shape, probably because it had fewer moving parts to degrade. I updated 3 firmware packages, ran diagnostic cycles on the telemetry relay hardware, and logged everything against the checklist with the institutional shorthand I've been writing for a decade. Time, status, initials. Late afternoon, I suited back up and did the exterior walk. The south-facing sensor housing had surface corrosion along the lower seam. Cosmetic, not structural, but I photographed it and noted it. The secondary wind shear array on the north side had a mounting bracket that had worked itself loose by about 4 millimeters. Probably thermal cycling over multiple winters. I torqued it back down and logged it. 2 minor findings, both within expected range for the maintenance interval. By the time I was back inside and making coffee on the single burner unit bolted above the equipment rack, I was already mentally structuring the day 2 task sequence. I ate, wrote up my end of day notes, and slept without thinking much about anything. Day 2 started the same way. Interior systems, cross-reference outputs against baseline, worked the list. I cleared 8 items before noon. The autonomous activity log was item 14. It's a routine verification. You pulled the log to confirm the bunker's automated transmission schedule is running on spec. Cross-check the outgoing packet timestamps against the master's schedule. Flag any gaps or irregularities. 10 minutes of work, usually. Sometimes 5. You initial it and move on. I opened the log interface on the primary terminal, pulled the last 90 days of transmission records, and started reading. The scheduled transmissions were there. Right timestamps, right packet sizes, right destination addresses. Everything matched the master schedule exactly. Then I scrolled back further, looked at the full archive. There was a second transmission stream. I didn't move for a moment, I just looked at it. Interleaved with the scheduled outgoing data, running all the way back through the archive. A parallel stream of outgoing packets, 340 bytes each, transmitting every 11 days. Consistent interval, no drift. The timestamps were clean and precise, no clustering, no gaps. I scrolled back to the earliest entry in the archive. February 14th, 2021. 4 years. The bunker had been unmanned for 3 of those 4 years, but the stream predated the last maintenance rotation. Someone had initialized it while personnel were still present, or shortly after departure. The stream had been running, unattended, through 2 Antarctic winters and a third now underway. I checked the destination address. Unregistered. Not in the NIPR address registry. Not in the Antarctic network routing tables I had access to. A well-formed address, syntactically valid, but pointing nowhere I could map. I wrote it down on paper, the actual address string character by character, because I wanted it somewhere that wasn't on this terminal. Then I looked at the packet structure. That's where it stopped being a clerical anomaly. The packets were formatted in NIPR's proprietary sensor telemetry protocol, not a generic data format, not a compression artifact or a firmware glitch producing garbled output. This was structured, correctly headered telemetry using the exact field architecture that the bunker's sensor suite was designed to produce. The kind of output format that required the technical documentation to read and required the system architecture to generate. You couldn't accidentally produce this. You couldn't produce it at all without knowing specifically what you were building. Someone had configured the system to report out, to send real sensor data, structured and readable sensor data, to an address that didn't exist in any registry I had access to, every 11 days for 4 years. I sat back from the terminal. The bunker was very quiet. The recycler was running. One of the fluorescent strips at the far end of the room had developed a faint flicker since yesterday. Barely perceptible, just enough to catch the edge of your vision if you weren't looking at it. 340 bytes, 11 days, February 2021. I looked at the address I'd written down on paper, then at the terminal, then at the first timestamp in the stream. Someone had been using this installation as a reporting tool for 4 years, while it was staffed and while it wasn't, without authorization, without any record I could find in the NIPR documentation I'd been giving, without any annotation in the maintenance history that the previous rotation had left behind. The checklist was still open on the desk beside me. Item 14, autonomous activity log verification. I didn't initial it. I didn't sleep well the second night. Kept thinking about the address on that paper, folded once and sitting under my notebook on the desk. Not anxiety exactly, more like the feeling of leaving a calculation half finished. Day 3 started before the ceiling strips fully warmed up. Of course, I made my coffee. I skipped the first 4 items on the checklist because I'd already cleared them mentally and went back straight into the terminal. What I hadn't done the night before was open the packets themselves. I'd confirmed the stream existed, confirmed it was unauthorized, structured, continuous, but I hadn't looked at what it was actually saying. That felt like the obvious next step, and also the one I'd been circling without admitting it. I pulled up the packet inspector utility, loaded the first transmission in the unauthorized stream, and cracked it open. It took me about 40 seconds to parse the field structure. The measurement type was BH04DEP, borehole 4 depth measurement. I sat with that for a moment. There were 4 boreholes at this installation. That was in the site documentation. 3 were ice core extraction points, still active, reporting temperature and particulate data through the regular scheduled stream. Borehole was listed in the site history as decommissioned. January 2, 2021. Sealed per procedure after encountering anomalous conditions at depth. I had the site history file open on the secondary screen inside of 2 minutes. The previous rotation's notes on borehole 4 were brief. The borehole had reached 67 meters before the drill operator noted unexpected resistance change, followed by a pressure inversion. Upward, not catastrophic, no personnel risk noted, but sustained and inconsistent with any known endglacial hydrology profile at this site, or any comparable site in the literature the operator had cross-referenced. The operator had sealed the borehole with an epoxy plug and a steel cap per protocol, marked it inactive in the sensory registry, and filed the anomaly as an unresolved environmental observation, pending further glaciological review. That review was apparently never scheduled, or if it was, I'd seen no record of it and anything handed to me at intake. I went back to the packet. The depth value in the February 14th transmission was 67.3 meters. I opened the next packet 11 days later, 67.6. Then the next, 67.9. I stopped initializing things in the checklist and just kept opening packets. Each one advanced the figure by exactly 0.3 meters. No variation, no rounding error, no drift in the increment. Something below that sealed cap had been moving upward at a perfectly consistent rate, and the bunker had been watching it and telling someone about it every 11 days for 4 years. I did the math without meaning to. 4 years, roughly 146 transmissions at 11 days interval, each advancing 0.3 meters. The current depth, the most recent packet sent 11 days before I arrived, was approximately 23.7 meters. It had started at 67 meters below the surface. It was now less than 24 meters down. I wrote that number on the same paper as the address. Then I put the pen down and looked at the borehole cap location marked on the site diagram, 40 meters northwest of the bunker, out on the rock shelf. I didn't go outside, not yet. I just noted where it was. I spent the rest of day 3 and all of day 4 inside the firmware. This is the part that's the hardest to explain to someone who hasn't done this work, because the process is genuinely tedious, and the stakes felt genuinely enormous, and those two things coexisted without resolving each other. I worked through the system architecture layer by layer: base firmware, sensor management stack, telemetry formatting module, the scheduler, the outbound packet handler. I ran every diagnostic available at the terminal. I cross-referenced the firmware version numbers against the NIPR master build documentation I had on the hard drive I'd brought down. I was looking for the thing that explained this, a hidden subroutine, something bolted onto the legitimate codebase that could initialize an unauthorized transmission stream and keep it running. I found nothing. Every diagnostic came back nominal. Every firmware checksum matched the build documentation. The scheduler showed no unauthorized tasks. The packet handler had no flagged exceptions. Everything was clean. I checked it multiple times, and everything came back perfectly fine. By the evening of day 4, I was sitting at the terminal with my notes spread across the desk, and I had the specific feeling of a load-bearing assumption failing. I've had it once before, years back, at my old relay station, where a telemetry fault I'd spent 2 days diagnosing turned out to have no identifiable cause and resolved on its own. That had been unsettling. This was different in kind. The axiom I've run my entire professional life on is simple. Autonomous systems do only what they are told. Firmware does not generate novel behavior. Code executes instructions, sensors measure and report. The system does not decide. That's not a philosophical position. It's an engineering reality, and it's what makes this work reliable enough to trust. The bunker was not malfunctioning, which left 2 possibilities, and I didn't like either of them. The first, someone had configured this deliberately. The previous rotation or someone who had access before or after them had intentionally written a process to monitor borehole 4, a decommissioned sealed borehole, and transmit its readings to an unregistered address on an 11-day cycle. This person knew the system architecture well enough to do it cleanly, knew the sensor protocol well enough to generate valid telemetry, and knew to leave no trace in any documentation that passed through NIPR's hands. The second possibility was the one I kept setting aside and kept coming back to. The bunker was installed on this ridge in 2018. Borehole was drilled in 2021. Whatever was at depth had been there, had been doing whatever it was doing before the drill reached it, before the installation existed, before anyone pointed instruments at the specific piece of glacier and decided it warranted monitoring. The second possibility was that the system had not been told to watch borehole 4, that it had encountered something its sensors could characterize, and had determined that characterization was worth reporting, and had begun doing so, which would mean the instrument had made a decision. I looked at the depth figure on my paper, 23.7 meters. I looked at the date of the most recent packet. I counted 11 days forward from that date on the calendar in my head. It was going to transmit again in 4 days. The margin notes on day 4 were still technically mine. Same handwriting, same pen, same checklist. But somewhere between item 17 and item 22 they stopped functioning as notes. Item 17 had an annotation beside it. Firmware checksum verified. Nominal, no anomalies detected. That was accurate. That was what the diagnostic returned. I'd run it twice and gotten the same result both times, which should have been satisfying, and wasn't. The nominal result does not explain origin of stream. That was fine. That was still observation. By item 22, the margin had become something else. I'd written, and the narrow strip of white beside the printed checkbox. The checklist assumes the system produces only what it was instructed to produce. This assumption is not documented as an assumption. It is presented as a property of the system. It may not be a property of the system. I sat back and looked at that for a while. Then I wrote, if it is not a property of the system, the checklist is measuring something it cannot describe. 11 years. I'd been working with these systems for 11 years, and the checklist had always been the frame, because it was always something that worked. It corresponded to reality in a way that made fieldwork tractable. You could check a thing, verify a thing, initial a thing, and move on. The list ended, and you either had a functional installation or you had a documented problem with a documented scope. That was the job. What I'd written in the margin was an argument against the job's foundations, and I'd written it in the margin of the job itself, in ink, on the official checklist I was supposed to initial and submit at rotation's end. I didn't cross it out. I moved on to item 23. Day 5, I didn't go near the borehole. I told myself I had reasons. I had some, Day 6, I went out in the early afternoon when the wind had dropped, brought the thermistor probe, a coil of line. The cap was exactly where the diagram said. A steel disc set flush into the rock, bolted at 4 points, a seam of gray epoxy around the rim. 2 bolts had backed out slightly, not enough to break the seal. I torqued them down and stood there with my hands in the steel for a moment longer than I needed to. I drilled the 2-centimeter access port through the epoxy, threaded the probe through it, and started lowering it. The upward pressure was there immediately. Not dramatic. There was a resistance, like the hole didn't want to accept the line. I kept feeding it down anyway. The temperature reading changed at around 40 meters. Not a spike. It came up slowly, by tenths, and then stopped and held, 0.4 degrees above the surrounding ice. I stood there in the wind with the spool in my hand and watched the display not move for 6 minutes. It didn't drift by more than 1/100th of a degree. I knew what it wasn't. It wasn't meltwater. It wasn't trapped air. I'd been in this work long enough to know what those looked like, and this wasn't either of them. What it was, I wrote down as anomalous thermal profile, origin undetermined, because that was the language available to me. And then I sealed the port back up and coiled the line and walked back to the bunker without looking back at that cap. Day 7, my initials on the checklist were smaller than usual. On item 26, the second letter broke mid-stroke. Day 8, I didn't initial anything, just left the boxes blank and let that mean whatever it meant. I was at the terminal by 2:45 in the morning. The ceiling strip at the far end of the room had been flickering for days and it was off now, so the light was just the 2 strips over the workstation. A small bright room inside a dark one. I had coffee. I had the packet monitoring the utility open. I waited. At 3 in the morning and 12 seconds, the scheduler executed. I watched the packet go out, 340 bytes again, borehole for depth measurement, same as every 11 days for 4 years. Watched the connection initiate, handshake, clear, 1.4 seconds. Then the connection didn't close, 11 bytes came back. The system parsed them before I could move. The transmission log updated. I saw the byte count, saw the format header, NIPR sensor telemetry protocol, exact field architecture, the same structure the bunker itself used, and then the connection closed and the room was quiet and I was sitting there holding a pen hard enough that my hand hurt. Somewhere in the file system, in a directory that hadn't existed 30 seconds ago, there was a file. I hadn't opened it yet. I finally opened it. 11 bytes, single data record, same format as everything else the bunker had been sending out for 4 years. Timestamp, source identifier, measurement type, value, checksum. The measurement type was an adept reading. SRF, LOC, VRT, meaning surface location, vertical, not where something was below the ice, the distance between itself and whatever was above it. 1.93 meters. I looked at it for a moment. Then I pulled up the GPS elevation record on the secondary screen and did the math I already knew the answer to. The bunker floor sat approximately 1.91 meters above the rock shelf. I was in the center of the structure, seated at the workstation, 2 centimeters off from where I was sitting. It had measured me. I put the pen down and didn't pick it up for a while. What I'd been treating as a one-directional problem, a system misbehaving in a direction I could at least face, wasn't that. The bunker had been transmitting outward for 4 years. Something had been transmitting back, patient and exact, keeping careful track of the distance remaining between them. I didn't sleep. There wasn't a point. Extraction was scheduled for 1400. I had 10 hours. I spent 2 of them photographing everything, every wall, every surface, every page of the notebook, every margin note I'd written as the checklist stopped being a checklist and started being something else. I uploaded it all to my personal server, watched the progress bar, verified the integrity, and deleted the local copies. The files on the terminal I left exactly as I'd found them, plus the response. I didn't flag any of it. I left it there for whoever came next. Then I sat down with the checklist and worked through it from item 1. Dated everything correctly, filed in the blank checkboxes from day 8. Wrote cross-checked, no irregularities next to item 14. Item 31, all boreholes confirmed sealed and inactive per site diagram. The cap was in place. The seal was intact. Sealed was accurate. Inactive was the word the checklist used, and I wrote my initials next to it. I signed the certification block, dated it, filed in the facility code. I went outside at 11. I don't know exactly why. I told myself I wanted air. The real reason was that I hadn't been able to look away from the borehole cap location on the site diagram. And at some point looking at the diagram stops being enough. The wind had dropped overnight. The glacier tongue was visible for the first time since I'd arrived. The low cloud had thinned and the light was flat and gray and even, the kind of Antarctic light that has no shadows in it, and I could see the tongue extending out into the bay maybe 200 meters below the ridge. I stood at the edge of the rock shelf and looked down at it. It had come up through the ice. I don't know how long I stood there before I could process what I was seeing as a thing, rather than as a disruption in the visual field that my brain kept refusing to resolve. The tongue was cracked along a wide seam maybe 40 meters from the rock face, and the ice on either side of the seam was pushed up and back like something had opened it from below. The meltwater running off the edges was catching the gray light, steam or breath, something rising off the exposed surface in thin wisps that the wind was already pulling apart. It was large, larger than I had any framework for. The part above the ice, I don't know how much of it was still below. The surface of whatever it was pale, the color of old fat. It had what I can only describe as a front, an orientation. One end was raised slightly above the other, and that end had apertures. I counted 4 before I stopped counting. Circular, dilating, rimmed with darker tissue that glistened even from 200 meters. They were pointed up the ridge, toward the bunker, toward me. I understand now why the previous rotation sealed the borehole and filed the anomaly as an unresolved environmental observation. I understand the compression in the language. There is no section heading for this. There is no column in the checklist. It didn't move toward me. It was there, fully surfaced, oriented directly at where I was standing, and it didn't come up the ridge. It just held that position with the apertures open. And I stood there for what the GPS timestamp later told me was 40 minutes and 20 seconds before I went back inside and closed the vestibule behind me. The helicopter came in from the north at 14:10. I heard it before I saw it. That pitch change as it clears a ridge, the rotor wash picking up grit from the rock shelf. I handed up the hard cases and the dry bag and climbed in. The door closed. I didn't look back at the glacier on the way up. I had the completion report drafted before we crossed back over the coast. Firmware updated, calibration corrected, minor corrosion documented, loose bracket torqued, all boreholes sealed and inactive, no finding requiring escalation. I transmitted it at 15:42. Hobart in the late March was warm enough to open the windows. I didn't open mine. I did the normal things, filed the expense report, submitted the maintenance summary, scheduled my dental appointment I'd been putting off since November, called my sister. I moved through it like a checklist, and I knew I was doing that. I kept doing it anyway. The field notebook was in the top drawer of the desk I'd pushed against the far wall. I hadn't opened the drawer since I'd put it there. 3 weeks after I got back, on a Wednesday afternoon, an email arrived. Subject titled, NIPR Archival System, Automated Transmission Confirmation. I read that subject line and didn't move. Then I clicked it. Packet size, 340 bytes. Timestamp, March 19th, 0311. Transmission status, successful. Destination address, I stopped, copied the address string against the one I'd written on paper inside the notebook's back cover. It matched. Not the NIPR network, not the Antarctic relay chain, my personal backup server. The same one I'd used to upload the photographs on day 10, the one I'd been running for 11 years, the one I'd checked the same morning out of habit. I sat in shock, then I opened the attachment. BH04DEP, 1.2 meters. 1.2 meters. The distance between the glacier tongue's surface and the bunker's lower steel plate. Not where it had been, where I was. I closed the laptop, stood up, went to the kitchen, and poured the cold tea down the drain, and stood at the sink looking at nothing. Somebody had a dead plant on a ledge across the alley. I looked at that for a while. I didn't report it. I'd made the choice 3 weeks earlier and the email confirmed it was wrong, and I still didn't change it. I know what the report would say. I've been writing it in my head since day 9. I don't know exactly why I haven't. Some of it is that I don't know what I'd be handing them. And what you hand NIPR shapes what they do with it. Some of it is that the bunker is officially unmanned. And an unmanned installation with a signed maintenance record and a clean transmission log is a closed file. Some of it is that it found my server, that it knew to send a number to me and not anywhere else. Some of it is what I saw on the glacier, the way it held its position, the apertures open and oriented and patient in a way that had nothing frantic in it, nothing reactive. It wasn't surfacing because it had finally broken through. It was surfacing because it had decided to. I don't know what it's been eating down there for however long it's been down there. I don't know what it wants with the distance between itself and me, or why that number keeps changing. I know it's been moving at exactly 0.3 meters every 11 days for 4 years. And I know that rate never varied once. And I know it's not moving at that rate anymore. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. Let me know what you think of this one in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. I'll see y'all in the next one.